Chapter 3: Fashioning a New Society in the Wilderness. In the 17th and 18th century, European settlers came to the New World to establish a new life. Many were escaping religious persecution and economic troubles. The European feudal system made it difficult for personal prosperity. For example, land could only be passed down through the family. The unraveling of feudalism was vitally important to the origins of American society. A capitalistic economy arose in Europe, and many big social issues arose. The upper class feared rebellion among those who were unemployed, thus reaching full force with the French Revolution. The French Revolution brought about ideas of freedom, autonomy, and personal initiative that was not once present. Ideas of Locke also contributed to these ideals and helped spur the fundamentals of American society. He introduced ideas of free speech, limited government, secularism, optimism, and science. Mercantilism was established in hopes that the development of the New World would help supply Europe with new markets and raw materials. The social structure in the early colonies was hierarchical. The wealthy owned tracts of land and were worked by the indentured servants. Between 1/2 to 2/3 of white immigrants came into the colonies as indentured servants. Thomas Jefferson and James Madison developed the Declaration of Independence of 1776 in order to separate from the royal government. The American Revolution occurred when the king was not compliant with the Americans' request of separation. Although the revolution brought about idealism and sacrifice, little social reform was accomplished. A constitution was drawn up in 1787, proposing a limited government uniting all of the colonies. They created a system of checks and balances to limit the possibility of an oppressive central government. They considered social policy to fall under the regulations of the state and local governments, thus splintering the development of the social welfare policies. Many Americans viewed the unemployment as less deserving and thus favored punitive punishment. For example, a child could be auctioned off as an indentured servant and his master get paid in return for taking care of the child. During the colonial era, the oppression of women, African Americans, and Native Americans became a huge societal and moral issue. It was thought that women were not only physically inferior to males, but also morally and intellectually. For example, wages were much less compared to those of men. A feminization of poverty was thought to exist during this time. After a husband's death, a wife could be left with nothing and forced into living in poorhouses, where women were forced into poorly paid work and thus poor living conditions. Native Americans also suffered hardships during the colonial period. They experienced brutal sufferings, forced labor, and were exposed to deadly diseases. One of the main reasons the settlers rejected the Native Americans is because they thought that anyone who was not of Christian faith was a heathen and subject to servitude. With the many deaths of Native Americans, the colonists needed workers who could withstand disease and hardship. Slaves could be brutally disciplined without consequence to the masters and were unable to protest to the court. Racism became a huge problem amongst the white community. Whites were able to mistreat slaves and Native Americans without guilt because they believed that they were non-human and uncivilized because they did not follow the Christian faith. All of these aspects show us that the New World was a hierarchical society. The upper class looked down upon those less fortunate. They gained wealth through the exploitation of indentured servants, tenant farmers, and slaves. Colonies found little reason to establish policies to redistribute land because mostly everyone had access to land. Non-governmental welfare programs began to emerge due to a weak central government with little control over social policies. Overall, the colonial era was a time of great social distress, social uprising, and economic growth.
Created using Powtoon.